Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm actually going to begin with a letter that was just handed to me moments ago from Rabbi who's the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey, and he asked that we share his words and sentiments with you this evening. I would like to thank everyone who played a role in this evening's event, and to those who have bravely come forward to learn more about the opioid crisis that is gripping our nation, our state, and each and every one of our communities. I am sorry that I could not join you in tonight's dialogue and personally lend my support to the Foreman family, Leanne, ETL, and their children, particularly Alana, and the Torah Academy of Bergen County. I do, however, appreciate the opportunity to share a few observations regarding the opioid crisis. Simply put, the opioid crisis is unprecedented in its scope and devastating in its intensity. In 2016, there were nearly 2,221 drug-related deaths in the state and nearly 65,000 nationwide. The majority of them, nearly 80% according to some reporting, were due to opioids. As compared to prior epidemics, this one does not discriminate. It affects all people regardless of their religion, income, education level, location, or background. An unprecedented crisis requires an equally unprecedented response and dialogue, such as the one that we are having this evening. Having spoken to many individuals, families, and loved ones afflicted by this crisis, I know how difficult it is for people to come forward to share their experiences due to the unfortunate stigma that is still associated with addiction. But what Alana and her parents and others like them are doing is not only brave, it is also critical to removing that stigma, to getting people help, and to helping survivors get their lives back on track. I am certain that tonight's event will lead to much needed discussion and help others who are seeking to help themselves for a family member or for a loved one. To enhance our response, I also recently announced the creation of New Jersey Cares, the Office of the New Jersey Coordinator of Addiction Responses and Enforcement Strategies, to facilitate and coordinate our response to the opioid crisis. It is designed to oversee the addiction-fighting efforts across the Office of the Attorney General and to create partnerships with other agencies and groups similarly committed to identifying and implementing solutions to the opioid crisis, in particular, and addiction in general. Some of the solutions that New Jersey Cares is developing include new addiction-fighting programs, including the creation of around-the-clock opioid response teams in municipalities throughout New Jersey, an electronic data sharing network to exchange opioid-related data among state agencies, and an online portal providing the public with real-time updates on overdose deaths and other addiction-related information. Again, I would like to commend the Foreman family for the decision to open themselves up in a deeply personal way to break the taboo associated with this issue. Please know that I am committed to working with each of you to take concrete steps to help your community and all others throughout the state in battling this epidemic. Together we will save lives, create greater awareness, and help to link New Jersey families and treatment resources. Sincerely, Rabbi S. Grigual, Attorney General. So I am the opening speaker for tonight's program, and I'd like to begin with a question that may be on some of your minds. And that is that why is it that I am here speaking to you tonight? Why am I on this panel? What do I bring to this discussion? I think as most of you know, and it's important that I begin with a disclaimer, I am not a clinician, I am not a mental health professional, I am not here to share a personal story. So why am I, a rabbi from this community, opening this evening's event? So I think there are two important answers that I'd like to ask you to consider. First and foremost, there is a halacha which is found in Shulchan Aruch and Orach Chaim, Siman Shin Chav Ches, which talks about what a person does when facing a potential life-threatening situation on Shabbos. And of course, as we all know, and you don't have to come here tonight to learn this, if there's ever a situation which is potentially life-threatening, there must be an immediate and decisive response to help and assist the person in crisis and in need. And in order to underscore the importance of moving and moving quickly, the Shulchan Aruch teaches that Hashoel, that a person who stops to ask a question, rather than acting and responding immediately, as if it were a Tuesday, if the person who needed medical attention succumbs, God forbid, and dies as a result of the sickness or injury, so the one who stopped to ask a question is a shofech dam. It doesn't mean literally, but on some level, bears some responsibility for the death. And the Mishnah Berurah over there quotes from the Magen Avram, the Pri Megadim, and other Achronim who teach based on Yerushalmi that Hanishal Harei Ze Maguna, that the one who is asked the question, presumably the rabbi, is also, in this regard, looked upon with disgust. If someone hesitates and stops to ask the rabbi, what do I do if somebody is bleeding to death on Shabbos? So not only does the one who stops to ask the question bear some responsibility, but the rabbi does himself. For it is his responsibility to teach his constituents and the members of the community before there is an emergency on Shabbos what is to be done, so that there be no hesitation, there be no delay. And the rabbi could be in his study learning, he could be away on vacation. But if there's an emergency that takes place under his watch, and someone goes looking for him, asks the question or can't find the rabbi, Harei Ze Maguna, then on a certain level the rabbi has blood on his hands as well. And I'm going to take a leap, and I do so in the presence of my colleagues, but I say humbly that even though we're not talking about Pikuach Nefesh on Shabbos per se, we are talking about a crisis of a completely different nature and dimension. If anyone here this evening can help a child, a sibling, a spouse, a parent, a friend, a colleague, and doesn't, the rabbis share part of that blame. The urgency is great, and our communal perceptions are way off, and we hope to begin to adjust that this evening. Secondly, and I suppose this is also something which doesn't need to be said, rabbis do not necessarily have profound or deep insights regarding this issue. Rabbis do not possess innate qualifications which enable us to detect or to treat substance abuse and addiction. But what rabbis do have is that we have exposure and access to the community, which is what enables me to stand before you this evening and look at you straight in the eyes and tell you, my friends, we have a problem. The problem is real, it is widespread, it is growing, it is not imagined, nor contrived to satisfy some secondary agenda. I have many stories that I could share with you this evening, and I'm sure my colleagues do as well. But I'd like to just share two brief anecdotes which reflect the extent to which there is such a disconnect between many of us and what is actually happening here among our friends and neighbors. Some time ago, we were hosting a Shabbos meal in our house, and somehow, and I don't know how the conversation came up, we were talking about drugs and alcohol, and a very well-meaning woman said, and if this is not an exact quote, it's fairly close, we may have unhealthy drinking habits, but at least members of our community don't use cocaine, heroin, or methamphetamine. Now the thing is that there was another couple at the table at that time, sitting right next to her, who were presently living through the horror of two of their own sons who have been in and out of treatment. In fact, at the time of this conversation, one of their sons was actually in rehab down in Florida, and he'd been there for at least a month. Even more disconcerting was the fact that these families were not mere acquaintances. The two women knew each other. They were fairly friendly. And my bird's eye perspective at that time was I was in total shock. I had one woman who was suffering, several inches from her, another one who was completely oblivious, and I was completely helpless at that moment to do anything about it, other than to sit there and wonder in disbelief. Another story. Several years ago, a member of my shul who is a recovering alcoholic, and as many of you know, recovering alcoholics are often, if not always, recovering for life. Always recovering. And he was at a Shalom Zachar, and I was sitting several chairs away from him, and someone walking around with a bottle of scotch offered him a drink. And not surprisingly, because like I said, he has been clean for years, he declined. And the individual insisted and said, please, take a little. And he said, no, really, it's okay. The guy says, come on, it's a great bottle of scotch. Look, everyone's having a little. And he said, no. And I am watching this and seething. completely paralyzed. I have not been authorized, I have not been given the right to go ahead and to expose this individual and to say, get off his back, there's more to the story you don't know. And I'm sitting there and I'm watching in total disbelief. Now, the message for this evening is not yet what we should and should not do at a Shalom Zachar. Maybe that's a conversation to follow. I'm not even going to say necessarily that a drink can never and should never be offered. But at the very least, my friends, don't ask twice. Don't press anybody. Don't insist. Don't pressure because, and this is really my message, you don't know. You would be surprised how many people in this community struggle with substance, alcohol abuse, and addiction. And this is why an event of this nature is so important, because many in our community feel so alienated and misunderstood. And we have to slowly but surely put some of this in the open to remove that facade and begin the process of a true and lasting destigmatization. And I'd like to talk for a moment about stigma. Where does the stigma come from? So as you all know, the stigma that exists regarding alcohol and substance abuse and addiction and mental health in general is not unique to our community. Indeed, much has been written and discussed about stigma in the general population. And this is a phenomenon which affects everywhere. However, it must be stated tonight that the stigma is more prevalent and is more pronounced in our community. Why is that so? Why is the stigma of substance abuse and addiction more prevalent and pronounced in the Orthodox community than in the general population? If I had more time than I've been given, I can go on and on about this, but I'd like to very briefly suggest 3 reasons. As a community, we tend to be very judgmental in general. We are critical of ourselves and certainly of others in the community. And to a certain extent, this comes from a good place. We expect a lot of ourselves and of our children. We value hard work and achievement. And often, when we perceive certain behaviors as a deviation from that set of values, our reaction, or very importantly, lack thereof, generates shame and isolation. As a community, therefore, we are at higher risk of stigmatization. Number 2, we place a very high value on morality, ethics, and behaviors. And we cannot help ourselves but see addiction as a poor reflection of all the above. A person who indulges excessively in alcohol and drugs must be an individual who, quite frankly, lacks morality, ethics, and appropriate behaviors. We attribute abuse and addiction to character flaws, lack of self-control, poor decision-making, dysfunctional upbringing. Please do your homework, folks. Don't take my word for it. I'm only a rabbi. I'm not qualified to say this, but it'll have to suffice for now. Alcohol and substance addiction is an illness. It is a disease. Nora Volko, who's the director of the National Institute of Drug Addiction, said, in all my years as a physician, and she's a woman, if I'm not mistaken, who's been practicing for at least 3, if not more decades, in all my years as a physician, I have never, ever met an addicted person who wanted to be an addict. Addiction is an illness. Some compare it to diabetes, cancer. Personally, I don't think such comparisons are necessary or even helpful. We are sophisticated enough to understand what it means that one has a physiological illness. But this notion that an illness can literally interfere with one's free will is a concept which is far from intuitive and very difficult to relate to. And so for one who does not have these struggles, it is quite challenging to be consistently fair and truly understanding in our judgment of others. In addition to being victims of genetics and biochemistry, individuals who suffer from addiction are often victims of circumstances as well. Well over 50% of those who suffer from addiction have been abused either physically, emotionally, sexually. They may have very possibly experienced trauma. And it must be acknowledged tonight that a not insignificant number of those who suffer from alcohol or substance abuse are victims of their experience of our educational system and the overbearing weight and pressure of our community's sometimes unreasonable expectation of our own children. And to find oneself in such a weak and precarious position, only to be further stigmatized, mislabeled, and misunderstood by one's friends, family, and community, is an unmitigated disaster and, frankly, an unforgivable tragedy. Finally, I believe the reason why there is such a strong stigma in our community is because we sometimes seek to close our eyes and place a wedge between us and those who suffer from an addiction, because we foolishly allow ourselves to believe that if we close our eyes, we can somehow inoculate ourselves and protect our children. There's a part of many of us that feels that if we embrace, and I mean that literally, that if we embrace one who is addicted to drugs, that may cause me to somehow become infected and more likely to develop an addiction myself. And as we sit here this evening, I hope that we will realize how oversimplified and really illogical that equation is. But nevertheless, these views are very widespread in our community, and we have to work together to address them. And our coming together this evening and acknowledging together that we have an issue, debunking these myths and clarifying truths, is a major step forward. What else can we hope to accomplish this evening? So you're going to hear from other presenters, and I will allow them to make their case to our community. Before I hand the floor over, I would like to make one more observation that may or may not come up later this evening. And here again, I wear my Rabbi hat as I say what I'm about to say. The alcohol, drug, opioid crisis does not happen in a vacuum. Indeed, not every encounter with alcohol is abuse, and not every experience with drugs will lead to an addiction. As a community, though, we cannot focus on abuse and addiction only. We must recognize that our tolerance in general creates a context and environment in which those who are genetically and or situationally predisposed will likely struggle, and many will succumb. We read this coming week of the prohibition of lifnei iver lo sitein michshol, and we as a community have to be very careful not to place a stumbling block before our friends and neighbors. If we are going to be responsible as a community, then we must be willing to consider what some may consider radical changes in community protocols, behaviors, and expectations. In my opinion, and this is a subjective conclusion, so you're welcome to disagree, our community displays a shocking degree of tolerance towards alcohol, marijuana, e-cigarettes, vaping devices of all sorts, and I can go on and on. And granted, these are not all the same, and they each have their own risks and levels of toxicity. But for the purpose of our discussion tonight, as we consider an approach going forward as a community, we have to recognize that we cannot detach this from the more pressing discussion of an opioid crisis. Now is not the time to discuss details, but if we're going to be serious about recognizing and addressing alcohol abuse and addiction, we have to be willing to take a closer look at alcohol consumption, be it recreational, cultural, or even, I dare say, ritual. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting, nor am I even imagining, that the entire community go dry. That from here on we make Kiddush Friday night, necessarily each and every one of us with grape juice, although in many homes it must be that way. But the fact of the matter is that some alcoholics, and again I don't have the statistics, maybe Rabbi Gluck can comment on this, but some alcoholics are born in Kiddush clubs, at Shalom Zachars, and at Purim Sudas. And that is a reality that we have to be willing to confront. It may only be a matter of time before recreational marijuana becomes legalized in the state of New Jersey, but we should be honest and vigilant in our recognition and response, as that development would add an entire new dimension to the threat and dangers that currently plague our community. There is so much more to say, but I really need to hand the floor over to this evening's presenters. Again, your presence this evening is a source of tremendous chizuk and a sign of strength and real maturity of our community. Personally, I want to thank you for joining us and participating this evening, and I'll just conclude with a bracha. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu assist and enable us to maintain the commitment, the persistence, the resolve to restore health and healing to our entire community. May He grant us the courage and wisdom to offer reassurance, support, assistance, guidance, and yes, even an embrace to each and every member of a community, even, if not especially, to those among us who need it most. Thank you.